Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday from the Author's Best Friend podcast. I'm your host, Lauren, and I'm here today with my new bestie, Hannah Levin. Hannah, what are you drinking?
Hi, I am drinking Purple Rain Sangria right now. I'm super into sangria. I love anything fruity, so this one is delicious. I do recommend.
Is it canned?
No, it's from a proper bottle.
Oh.
It's a screw top, but still a proper bottle.
Yeah, that sounds yummy. I love sangria. I'll give a little story behind my drink before I tell you what it is. So I had originally planned, I was thinking, I got to get work done this evening. I don't want to have too much of a buzz after my podcast. So I'll just have my coffee and my water. And then I thought, well, that's not any fun. And I also worked very hard this morning, got a lot done. So I was like, I'm going to treat myself. Well, I have these little travel wines in my desk at work, and they've been in here for a couple years now. And so it's possible that I will be slowly poisoning myself as we go through this podcast. But it's also a proper screw top bottle. It's just pocket size. Mm-hmm. So, and it's a Cabernet. So cheers. Thanks so much for being on the pod today.
Thank you for having me. Oh my God, I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm personally super excited because you're my first fantasy author on the podcast. And I just started reading fantasy probably in the last year and a half. So right now I'm very much so in my just whatever pop culture is telling me to read. I've only read ACOTAR and Fourth Wing. And then I've started a little bit in Throne of Glass. And so I'm really excited to hear just really what the creation of a fantasy world looks like and how those ideas come to be. And so I have lots of questions. But first, I wanted to introduce that you're releasing your debut novel on July 9th of this year. It's called The Treasured One. Did you want to give us just a little overview of the plot?
Yeah, so essentially it follows this girl named Avery. She's 22 years old. She lives in our version of the world, so real life, our world. And what happened was a few years back, before she was born, this rift opened up in the world that leads to what we would consider to be kind of your typical high fantasy world with fae and magic and all that. So when that rift opened up, shortly after that, a few humans were born with magical powers, and Avery was one of those children. So she ended up being kind of commandeered by the U.S. government and brought to the White House. And so she kind of grew up there, spent most of her life there, and has been really sheltered her whole life, not being allowed to go outside or anything like that, because she has healing powers, and they're very high in demand, obviously, from, all the people who have cancer and even Crohn's disease and things like that, that are, debilitating long-term chronic illnesses, things like that. So she's lived this kind of sheltered life, and then all of a sudden her powers stop working, and then she's got to figure out what's going on with them, because she doesn't really know anything about her magic and how it works. And so the government ends up organizing her trip through the rift, where she's going to meet with the Fae and kind of get some information, and they're going to help her figure out her powers and figure out what's going on with her. And so there she meets the second prince of the Fae leading family, Riel. And from there, it becomes a lovely romance and adventure as she's figuring herself out in this new magical world and learning about all the crazy things that she never really had a chance to experience in the real world, and then also things that don't exist in the real world, like all these magical creatures and magic in general. So, it's a pretty fun adventure, romance, fantasy, all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's amazing. So Avery knows that she has special powers, obviously, but she's never really been around anyone else who has them, or doesn't really know how they manifest.
Yeah. I mean, she's familiar with some of the other children who have these magical abilities, but they don't have any teachers. They don't have any books, that talk about magic. It's a version of our world. So they don't have information on this. They don't know what it is. So they're just kind of feeling their way around it. And it's in a way, I wanted it to be symbolic of our journey as like young adults, and trying to figure out the world around us and how crazy everything is, but also with magic thrown into the mix. So like kind of a bit of a coming of age story too.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit naive to this, like I said, because I just started dabbling into fantasy, but did SJM, did she not create this idea of like Fae or this world with Fae, or did she and then people kind of stem off of it? Because I feel like this is a common, I guess I don't know if you would call them a creature, but it's just like it's a common species that people are writing about, and I'm curious about the origin of that, or like behind the decision to either build off of that, or where some people just kind of like start over and write some other sort of type of species.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I know, because I'm not exactly an expert in it either, but she definitely didn't come up with these herself. I mean, she had her own flavor, you could say. But, Fae and some of the creatures that I mentioned in my book, not necessarily the ones in her books, but these kind of creatures have been mentioned for thousands of years in mythology from various sources. There's Greek mythology and there's, oh my God, I'm totally blanking, but all kinds of different cultures, have their own take on these kinds of magical creatures. She was really, as far as I know, the first one to kind of popularize this idea of Fae being very human, very kind of more like Tolkien's elves in appearance. Like
Gotcha.
they're pretty human. They have, pointy ears, and in her case, many of them have wings or other kind of slightly more animalistic attributes. But for the most part, they're kind of human, more elvish. So I think that's kind of new in that was a more recent past few decades kind of thing. Traditionally we have like Shakespeare's idea of Fae where you have like Titania and like the little, pixie type winged creatures, or you have like brownies and leprechauns and kobolds and things like those. So yeah, so there's so many sources that you can pick up these incredible things from and then kind of try to make them your own. So that's what I think all these authors are trying to do. And SGM definitely did a version of them, and it's been popularized since, her stuff is so amazing and has reached so many people, but not the first one.
So what contributed to your decision to decide to sort of build off of this? It just based off what you were saying, it makes it sound like your Fae are maybe a little bit different. Maybe they don't have wings, or like what was your decision to kind of build off of this story with Fae and then put your own sort of spin on it?
My inspiration for this book in general was kind of to take some of the things that are popular right now and then put my own twist on them. So in this case, what I wanted to do was take this idea that there are a lot of people who recently got into fantasy who will think that Fae is this particular version of Fae that was popularized by SJM, but there's like so much more to that. So in this case, like the humans don't really know a lot about the Fae, but the main people that they've been in contact from the other side of the rift with is the leading family, and they are your typical kind of more human, more elvish looking Fae. But then as Avery is in that world, she's seeing these other people that humanity has no idea exist that are more kind of the classic renditions of Fae, different creatures like satyrs or fauns, different creatures that may not have been mentioned in mythology. So it's kind of playing off of the idea that oftentimes certain people will have a very limited scope just based off of their own personal experiences. And the reality might be a much bigger world than you initially think it is. So kind of wanted to go off of that and like use some of the inspiration from what's popular right now and then some of those mythological creatures and kind of bring everything together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How do you keep track of all of these details? Like if you're sort of mixing between using like mythology where it's already sort of established, like this type of creature behaves in this type of way, versus sort of like putting your own creative spin on those? Like, what do you use to keep track of your characters and like what their abilities are and what their powers are and X, Y, and Z?
So that's why I feel like fantasy is so fun to write because for the most part, you just make shit up. Like you're the author and you're kind of free to do whatever you want. But at the same time, like I have tons of notes because you still want to be consistent as an author. Like you can make whatever up, but you still need to be consistent with the rules of the world that you create. So yeah, I have lots of notes that I keep track of. A lot of my creatures might be like inspired by certain existing creatures. So for example, I might have a character where like just based off of this description, you might be like, oh, that sounds like a classic like Greek nymph or something like that, if you're familiar with Greek mythology. But they won't be called a nymph. Like they'll have their own word for, them as creatures. And again, what I was thinking was like in a real world, like if this were legitimately how things were, how might this happen, in real life? So I was thinking that it could be that over the course of many thousands of years, even though this is the first time that the rift exists, you still might have had some of the Fae creatures from this realm accidentally traveling onto Earth at some point in time and being seen by human beings. So maybe, mythology was actually based on real things that people saw and heard. But maybe they got the name wrong or they made up their own name for these creatures. That's not actually what they call themselves because they never talked to each other or something like that. So yeah, I was kind of wanting to draw on realism a little bit and then make up my own world and put my own creative spin on it. But lots of notes to answer your original question, how I keep track of it, lots of notes.
And these are these just written down in a notebook somewhere or have you typed them in a Word doc?
I have them in a Word document. Usually what I'll do is I'll have it in the same Word document as my manuscript that I'm working on. It'll be like twice the length of what it actually is, and it'll be like the manuscript and then just notes, pages and pages and pages of notes. And then I'll be referring to those if I ever come across an area where I'm like, wait, did I already make a rule for this or is this new? Like my magic system, I have a lot of different notes on that. My characters and the different species and all that, I have lots of different notes on that. So yeah, pages and pages of notes.
Yeah, well, once you have like diehard fans, which maybe you're already starting to collect, they'll call you out on those things. They're going to be like, well, in book 1, you said that this character couldn't do this thing. So you're like, I'm sorry, I missed that in my 12 pages of notes about
I'm not looking forward to that, to be honest, because it's so hard. Like as an author, you are taking months and months and months to write this book. So of course there are little details you're going to forget versus the reader. Like they might, knock that book out in an afternoon. So of course, like they're gonna pick up on all those details and they're gonna have it fresh in their head. And you're like, how did they remember that? I wrote that, last year, and yeah, now I don't remember. Or like now I'm currently working on the sequel, so I have to make sure I remember everything that I mentioned from the first book that would be relevant in the sequel, so I can keep that consistent. So yeah, it's rough. I'm just thank heavens this is not going to be some 20 book long series. I don't know how those authors do it.
Yeah, that's wild. And you never know what people are going to cling on to. Like you might have just randomly thrown out something that some character does and you weren't really planning on bringing it up again, but then something happens that contradicts it later and someone was like, I've been thinking about that and that doesn't match.
And I've had so many ARC readers already who are like, oh, like they'll message me early on when they're just a few chapters in and they'll be like, oh, I'm picking up on this. I'll bet this is how it's going to go. And I'll be like, oh, that's not how I intended you to think that was going to go. But, no spoilers.
I love that about fantasy. I think that's one of my favorite things about talking about fantasy books to somebody else is like the interpretation you have about what this particular thing means or what it means for this character to have this power or something is like you could just really, people will just be spinning their wheels speculating and you're like, that actually didn't mean anything. I just casually threw that in there.
Oh yeah. And they might be like, "Oh, like is this religion based off of this?" Like, and I'm like, "Honestly, like I was just trying to make them a well-rounded, like have their own culture and everything." Yes, I based it off of what knowledge that I have of world religions, but like it's not that deep. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's not that deep. Well, speaking, I guess, of that, is there a particular reason that you made Avery like a healer? Is there something particular about her being able to bring that into the modern world?
Yeah, so part of it was that I was a little tired of seeing people that just had like destructive, super strong powers. Like love a strong female lead as much as the next person, but it felt like certain characters were kind of blending together, and I wanted to have somebody who was not by nature a fighter, but she's still kind of trying to be strong in her own way. And healing is obviously something that would be super valuable in our world. So it was also that kind of, I just thought it would be so interesting if, again, from a realistic standpoint, if something like that happened in real life, what would happen? I mean, they wouldn't let her live on her own and just do her own thing. She would be swarmed by people trying to get her to heal them. She wouldn't be able to go out and show her face in normal society. It would be a mess. And then I thought, the government, the US government would probably want to have a piece of that. So they would end up asserting their control over those sorts of resources, those magic people. So yeah, I was trying to come at it from kind of a realistic standpoint and also trying to put a more kind of unique type of female lead out there where she's more sweet and nurturing and taking care of others, and that's who she is, and that's represented kind of in her ability too. But she kind of finds herself and learns how to use it and becomes strong in her own way. So,
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great.
hmm
As somebody who also finds that their like nurturing side is probably their strength, like
hmm
I don't know how much I actually connect a lot with characters, like the female characters in fantasy books. I think they're very fun to watch and things, but like at the end of the day, I don't know how much of myself I see in them. I'm like, if I was in that scenario and this like hot male fae is like, okay, well now we've got this war and I'm gonna train you. I'd be like, I can't do that. It's
yeah,
like,
I'm like, yeah, no, like I can't hurt people. I can't kill people. Gore, I don't deal with gore. Like, like, let's not.
yeah, I'm not trying to take any lives. I
hmm
can't run up that flight of stairs. Like that's not
Yeah,
gonna
yeah.
work for me. Do you have anything else that I think that I could try to do? So yeah, I think that's nice to have a female character who's actually been a little bit more touch of with the nurturing and I think you're right. I think having that sort of skill to heal people is something that in the modern world would be very sought after, particularly because, you can create a military using robots and things, but like to be able to heal and nurture, modern world still hasn't really figured that out. And so to have somebody who could literally save somebody's life with superpowers, I would definitely be sought after. Like, are you a shadow daddy girly? Does Riel have any superpowers that you can disclose to us?
He does have abilities. It's not really a secret, but I will say, like, he's not a shadow daddy. I'm so sorry. And I'm all for the shadow daddies too. We love our morally gray men. But I really like my golden retrievers and my cinnamon rolls. Like I am looking for a guy where he has qualities that I would actually like in a guy in real life too. Like I have my
Not a murderer, you mean?
no, as attractive as that can be, it's not my thing personally. I just wanted there to be again kind of that thread of realism where you can be like, oh yeah, like he's not just hot, but he has appealing qualities, appealing personality traits. So he's a cinnamon roll. That's how I describe him. That's how I've been kind of marketing him. And he's just sweet and supportive and honest and that kind of guy. So
So what would you call the romance trope? Like, I'm imagining if you've got a healer and a cinnamon roll, it's not an enemies to lovers. Is it
No.
like a friends to lovers, or is it like a mentor student thing?
Yeah, honestly, it's like a little bit of those two. Yeah. Obviously, this doesn't really make sense, but I was saying strangers to friends to lovers because
Mm-hmm.
generally when you say friends to lovers, people think, oh, like they're like childhood friends and just now they're
Yeah.
like thinking about a romantic relationship. So it's not like that. But at the same time, I wanted there to be kind of gradual relationship development so that they kind of start out as friends, and then become something more. So even though technically that's how most relationships work, where you start out strangers and then you become friends and then you become lovers, I wanted to kind of communicate how it was like, yeah, there's no enemies element. The conflict is not between them, it's an external conflict. So it's also, I have been saying it's on the cozier side because there's that kind of more of a focus on the relationship development and because they are kind of just cute together and then the world is like things are burning around them and they're just like in their own little world kind of. So yeah, I've been calling it kind of strangers to friends to lovers. There's a little bit of a forbidden love element because obviously these are two people from very, very different worlds. So that's technically another trope is the different worlds trope.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, also, and then technically, he's called a prince, but that's kind of as the humans understand it because their concept of royalty is like a king and queen and princes, versus technically he's to the Fae a leading family, which is more like I don't know, like a mayor type position where like he's not like a king, but that gets complicated. So yeah, like he's kind of like this prince, this person who has a position of power on the face side of things. And Avery, like even though she's integral to the human kind of human society in general, she's not really in a position of power. I mean, she's a tool of the government essentially. So they're in very different power positions, and it's not really her choice who she has a relationship with, and especially with somebody, in literally another world and in somebody in that powerful position. So kind of got a little bit of a forbidden love element, but yeah, I think those are like the main tropes that are going on here.
Wow, I'm super excited. I'm all like anxious now. Like July 9th, it's too far.
Yeah.
So rewinding a little bit, like how did you even decide that you wanted to put, I mean, I feel like writing a fantasy novel is a huge feat. And so how
Oh,
did you
yeah.
even go into deciding to write a book?
Well, so I've always loved writing. Even, gosh, since I was like a preteen, I used to like have tons of spiral bound notebooks and I used to like scribble out random plot ideas and scene ideas and things like that. So I've been writing a long time. Originally, I couldn't come up with a full idea for like a plot. Like I might have an idea for a character and I might have an idea for a scene, but I didn't have a whole story. So back then I would write anime fan fiction and I would write like stuff like that. So I got kind of popular on some of those websites like fanfiction.net for my anime fan fiction. But at some point I was like, all right, like I've kind of outgrown that. Not so much outgrown it. I still have an appreciation for those spaces and all that. But I really wanted to make something original. And I had all these ideas. I still have so many ideas, but it's really hard for me to sit down and actually write it to completion. I mean, I'm sure anyone could resonate with that. But especially because I have ADHD and I didn't actually know this for most of my life. So for most of my life, I was like, oh, it's just normal that you get excited about something and start it and then lose all drive and never look at it again. Like that's just normal. That's how people work. And then at some point it was like a couple years ago. So I was like 23 when my sister got diagnosed and she was like, it's hereditary. Like maybe you should talk to somebody. And I said, I I don't think I would have it. I think I would know, but sure. And it's just one of those things where if you have a condition your whole life, you develop coping mechanisms, and that's your only perception of how to deal with the life around you. So that's your normal. So then having somebody tell you like, oh, that's not actually how most people work. Like you're a little different. That was like groundbreaking to me. But long story short, I got medicated, properly medicated, and that all of a sudden I was like, oh, darn, like now I am piecing together a plot and I'm sticking to it and I'm writing and I'm still interested in writing, months later, the same book that I have been writing. So that was like crazy to me. But yeah, so that was kind of my journey. But I always knew I wanted to write. So this was a long time coming, I think.
Was there a particular catalyst that made this story the one you knew you wanted to publish? Like, I know that you said that your fan fiction had gained a little bit of traction, and then also, you started really focusing more on your mental health and sort of getting that a little bit on track. And that helped a little bit more with your motivation and staying focused. But was there any particular moment where you were like, okay, I'm writing this and like, this is going to be it. This is going to be the one that I'm going to put out?
Honestly, no. I had no idea that this was going to be the one I was going to finish. Like, I had had so many ideas in the past and it had never worked, But I was inspired at the time. Like, I had recently gotten into actually Sarah J. Maas and Akatar and all those. So I was very inspired by the Romantasy genre. And I'd always been like a creative person. So I wanted to come up with my own world and come up with characters that I felt like I wasn't seeing enough of, and, a plot that felt unique to me, and all of that. But yeah, I had no idea that this was going to be the one. And then I was writing it and I had like an outline, which I never did before. Like I had an outline and I had a full idea for where it was going to end up, which like I had never been able to come up with before. So I was like, this one is just like coming to me. I guess this is the one. So yeah.
Did anyone know that you were doing this? Like, did you tell your sister, or did any of your friends know?
Oh yeah, yeah. My friends, my family, my mom was one of my beta readers, like way early on. So yeah, they knew, they were very supportive. I'm so lucky to have so many supportive people in my life. So that made a big difference too in continuing to write it and to get that feedback early on, because so many authors still have issues with imposter syndrome, and for me early on, like I was so delicate. I was like, what if they hate my book? Like, this is, I'm putting myself on the pages here. Like they're going to hate it, blah, blah, blah. And my friends had nothing but supportive things to say. And that was helpful at that stage. Like I still know I'm going to get criticism for sure. And I have to be prepared for that. But in those early stages, it really helps to have people that will only give you positive support, just so you can get it done, and then you can kind of face the hordes later on. So.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah, I think you need at least a foundation to know that this book is good. And then I think, like, it's not just me that thinks that. There are other people that think that this book is good and worth reading. And then you can, I think, at least have strong enough structure to put it out there to strangers who then might rip it apart because they don't like the trope, or because they, whatever, it's not their thing, or whatever their grievance is with it. At least you can face those and be like, okay, but at the end of the day, the book is still good. It's not for everyone, but the book is good. And I have that. And I think if you don't get that foundation, then you can take people's criticism as more of like, maybe I just shouldn't even done this. Maybe this isn't even, maybe nobody even wants to read this. And so I think that's great that you have that community that you can share that with. Does your mom have, or does anyone in your family have any like writing background? Like, do you have like an editor or anyone that you work with?
No, I mean, some of them are also where I was, where they have been writing on and off for a while, but haven't like finished anything or haven't published anything. For the most part, they're readers first and foremost. So my siblings, my mom, my friends. But that's really helpful to get a reader's perspective and be like, do you find this interesting? Like, that's the first question is like, are you enjoying it? And then to be able to bounce ideas off of them too, because, all writers, like in general, I guess I shouldn't generalize, but a lot of writers are readers too. First and foremost, they're readers. So to be able to get kind of different perspectives when it came to like when I had a manuscript and I was trying to get more kind of constructive feedback, there were a lot of resources that I found online, subreddit, Facebook groups, things like that, where I could connect with other writers. There were places where I was sharing my blurb and really trying hard to get a perfect blurb. And initially, I was planning on publishing traditionally. So there was also a query letter involved that I was trying to get perfect. Those resources definitely help running things by other writers. But yeah, so that was kind of how it looked like for me.
I want to ask you about the publishing, but I'm curious, did you ever get like a friend or a family member that was like, Hannah, it would be so cool if you did this thing or if this person had this power? Like, did anyone try to give you any, like, you should put this in the book?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely had their opinions. Some of them were great. Some of them were very helpful. Like, I might ask, like, not so much like a certain power or something, but like, oh, like, should I do this with this character or should I go in this direction? And they were able to give me some really helpful feedback there. So that kind of thing, they were super helpful on. There were a couple suggestions that they made that I ignored, not to be mean, but just to be like, that's not the right fit for this story, but I'll keep it in mind for something in the future, maybe.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like if you're writing like a contemporary romance, there are bounds of things that you could and couldn't write. Like you read a book and you're like, that wouldn't actually happen, or that person wouldn't actually say that. But in fantasy, you don't really have a lot of bounds. Like a lot of it's just kind of like whatever your mind can come up with, you can make it possible because it's a fantastical world, and whatever's gonna happen is gonna happen. You're probably a little bit more limited because part of your story is structured within the modern world, but for a lot of that, it's just kind of like it could be whatever it's going to be, and these are not human, like a human species necessarily, and so they could say things that a human wouldn't say, or like they could do things that we wouldn't do, and it's just kind of like that's the character that I've created. So I feel like when you're getting people that are reading a fantasy book, it kind of awakens their creativity, and especially if it's like, oh well, Hannah's asked me to read this so that I can give feedback, and now I've got all of these ideas about things that she could get in the book. You then have to kind of reel that in a little bit. Like your imagination looks a little bit different than what mine does, but appreciate the point.
Yeah, especially my friends who are also writers, they get so excited because naturally as a writer, like you're really good at coming up with ideas. So I would have to be like, all right, thank you. Appreciate your input. I'm going to go back to, my story now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Okay. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about your journey through working through a publisher. So you had thought about maybe doing big traditional publishing, and now you're working with a small publishing company, Aethon Books. And so did you want to just talk a little bit about like how you came to the decision to do traditional publishing, such that you like were working on a query letter and then you decided that wasn't for you? If you want to just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the main thing that I was thinking was, this is my first book and I'm a totally new author, so I want to have some guidance in this stage of my career. So that's why I was thinking that having a literary agent would be really useful, and kind of knowing, because at that stage I was like, oh, like traditional publishing is always the goal. Like that's how it's done, in that stage of where I was at. So I did all the research. I had no idea how the process worked. So for, anyone listening who might not know how the process works, essentially the first step is you need to secure a literary agent. So you're going to have this query letter, which has like a little bit of information, like top meta information about your book. So like the word count, the genre, that kind of thing, title. And then you're going to have like a blurb, but it's going to be a little bit more comprehensive, more of a summary, but not quite like a full synopsis yet. And then you're going to have like a little short bio, and the whole thing is going to be like 250 to 400 words. And it's essentially like a cover letter, but for a literary agent. And there are resources that you can use to find literary agents and to track them and all this. But essentially, if you want to get traditionally published, you need that agent because all of the big publishers, they don't accept unagented submissions straight from the author. So you need that agent as a go-between. So that's kind of the first barrier, so to speak, because they get so many submissions. They are swamped all the time, and they have to be very selective about who they work with. So it's very, very competitive to find an agent at all, and then hope that they're able to market your book to a publisher, and you make it with a big publisher. So I was kind of in the thick of it, trying to find an agent initially. I had submitted maybe like 20 query letters. I had gotten a few rejections at that point, a couple of requests for the full manuscript, because usually you'll lead with just like the first 10 pages or the first chapter, whatever they request. Every agent is different. So yeah, a couple of requests for the full manuscript, and they were reviewing it, but also the process takes forever. Like traditional publishing, from the point that you start looking to an agent to the point that you're published might be like 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it could take like 6 months to a year to find an agent. And then you're going to be editing your book and they're going to help you with the editing process. And then you're going to try to like go to auction and get a publisher. Like they'll want your book. So then they have their own editors who are going to look at it. And that's going to take months and months and months. And then there's cover design and setting up the marketing and the formatting of the book and like all that. So it takes forever. And I'm not a patient person. So here I was like setting up for this and I had sent a few query letters and it had been a couple of months and I was already like getting antsy. So I was like, all right, let me try just submitting to a couple of independent publishers as well that accept unagented submissions. And that can be tricky because you really have to do your research. There are a lot of predatory publishers out there, a lot of what they call vanity presses that will publish, quote unquote, anything, but the author pays to have their book published. So they are making money off of you right from the start. They are not incentivized to market your book well and make your book a success because they made their money off of you, and that's that. So you really have to be careful. There are a lot of those, unfortunately. But I found a few that were legitimate and that had a good kind of reputation and that had worked with a few authors in a similar genre in the past. And that's how I came across Athon Books. And they specialized in sci-fi and fantasy. And even though they didn't specifically say anything about romance, I was like, well, fantasy romance, romantasy, like it's got a lot of fantasy. So like, let's see, like, and romantasy as a genre was so big. I mean, it still is, but around now, like it's so popular. So I was like, hey, I mean, if you ever wanted to get into romantasy, like now's your chance. Here's my book. It's great. So I sent it into them and they actually got back to me really quickly. Again, like for the industry as a whole. I think they got back to me in like a week or less than a week. And they were like, yeah, I want to see the whole thing. So I sent the whole thing and they were like, this is great. We want it. So
Wow.
I was like, okay, cool. Like I was not expecting kind of so early on in the process to be getting such a positive reception for it. So, they were telling me a little bit about what they do and everything, and they are full service. So I don't pay anything. And even though they don't have the same level of support that a big publisher would, they still had a lot of experience. They had a lot of successful books behind them. So I was confident that they had kind of the level of mentorship that I was looking for. But also I appreciated that without an agent, I would have a lot more freedom on my end without that kind of very traditional go-between person. So I felt like it was a good mix of getting familiar with publishing and how publishing works at this stage in my career, but also still having the freedom and having the input that I want to really keep my first book my own. So it just ended up being a perfect fit.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Are there any cons to working with a publisher in this particular case? Like, do you have sort of full range on what the marketing looks like and your timeline and sort of like the aesthetic of your book? Like, is there anything like contract wise that like sort of limits what you can and can't do with the book?
Yeah, I mean, there is. Any contract will have some limits because you're sharing this piece of it's still, your property. Like I'm retaining, copyright and all that. But yeah, as far as the marketing goes, as far as the cover goes, I had a lot of input. I can make requests and all that, but they always have the final say. Like the cover, I wanted to go in one direction, and they very kindly were like, that's not going to be the best for the market. If you want the book to really be successful, we should go in this direction. And that is the kind of mentorship that I was looking for. Even though I had a certain image in mind, I am young and inexperienced and new to this world, and I don't know what sells. So having that kind of input was really helpful. And I'm happy with the cover, even if it's not the original vision that I had in mind for it. As far as marketing goes, they've been very accommodating in terms of trying out like social media influencers and things like that. Like I brought that to them where I was like, Bookstagram is so big right now. Like, let's make use of that and influencers and all that. And they were kind of like, well, that's not how we usually do things, but we'll give it a try. And yeah, the romance was new for them because again, like they had really their main thing was like progressive fantasy and like lit RPGs, if you know, like those kind of niches. So they had never really done romance, and they were thinking initially, okay, we'll market it like we market fantasy. I was kind of like, well, fantasy, romance, romantasy, you probably want to market it a little bit more like romance because it's really more probably going to appeal to the people who like romance versus the people who like pure fantasy.
Hmm.
So we kind of had to work around that and figure out some new things. But we're learning together, so that's also kind of fun. And then there are a couple of other authors who they also brought on around the same time as me, and we have a little Discord group together. We're all friends, so that's really fun. And yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. The Discord group is very cool.
Mhm.
So in terms of promoting the book, they sort of take on all of that. Like, is any of the pressure still on you to like promote the book on your own page, or are they sort of like, like do they share any of the graphics and things with you for you to do it to do any of that, or is it all in-house and then they just kind of take care of doing that?
Yeah, so it's still a lot on the author to do the promotions and stuff. Like when the book comes out, like they're gonna handle like pay-per-click ads on like Amazon and Instagram and stuff. But like I manage all my own social media. That is all me, all of my all of my posts, and that is why my Instagram page is not that aesthetic because I am not very good at it. But I'm just kind of doing my own thing there.
Your Instagram makes me giggle. It makes me laugh.
Honestly, like it's a mix of like I don't know how to do like the fancy posts that all the good bookstagrammers do. And it's also like that's not really like me. So all the stuff that I share, it's like reading and writing memes. It's
Yeah.
my
The
dogs.
memes are so
It's
funny.
like, yeah. It's like whatever I come across that I think is cool or funny and want to share. And then I also do book reviews because, again, like even though I'm an author, I'm a reader first.
Hmm.
So I do reviews of other things. I've been getting into reading arcs by other authors. And yeah, so I'm just kind of doing my own thing. But they take care of like the more formal marketing, I guess you could say. And then when it comes to like connecting with my fans, that's so weird to say. But like, yeah, connecting with my readers and the social media side of things, that's all me. And then I'll be on like Facebook and Facebook groups too. And I've actually also been reaching out to some local bookstores. That's tricky because, again, when you go the small publisher route, you don't really have access to brick and mortar stores. Once you get into the publishing world, you learn that it's like super, not just competitive, but like there's the big players and they kind of have control of like most of it, and then the little players really they get the crumbs essentially. So it's really hard for small publishers and for self-published authors to get into brick and mortar stores at all. So I'm trying to kind of get into some local bookstores. There's the potential to if they want to carry my books. So I'm trying to just reach out, on a personal level and being like, hey, I'm a local author. I think my book is cool. Maybe you want to check it out. But my book is never going to be in Walmart and Target and all that. It's just not going to happen. But that's fine. I'm happy with where I'm at, and I'm sure, as I come out with more books, I'll continue to kind of grow and make a name for myself. But I don't need like huge marketing efforts either. So, this works for me working with a small publisher. So.
And so when you pitched your book to them, did that include any and this is part one, like there will be other books that follow, or were they sold just on the single book?
Good question. Yeah. So I was told early on when I was, researching publishing and everything, is they said you want a standalone book because as a debut author, you're never going to be able to sell someone on a trilogy. They just don't trust you. You don't have that relationship yet. So they said you want it to be a standalone. And that actually worked fine for me because one of the things that I was going for was I recently, like the last few years, I've just been tired of life. Not like in a negative way. But just like I'm exhausted, like work and home life and all that. And I have not had the mental energy to get into an intense multi-book series like ACOTAR and Throne of Glass. I loved them a few years ago, but I don't have the energy to enjoy something like that these days. So part of what I had wanted to contribute was something that has kind of those same vibes and the romantasy feel, but something that stands alone so you could read it in a day if you really wanted to, or, a few weeks, and then you're not hanging on the edge of your seat for the sequel and all that. So I marketed it as a standalone. That was how it was always intended to be. They did ask me if I wanted to have to make it a series. And I said there is serious potential because I did have a plan for a second book and possibly for a third book. So I said, if you want it, it's yours. And the initial contract that they offered me was 3 books. And then I said, I'll give you the one. I don't want to make promises I'm not sure I can keep because I'm not sure at this stage that I will consistently be able to write. Like maybe this was a fluke, I don't know. So I was like, I don't want to make promises, but I'll give you the one. And they were luckily very willing to work with me on that. So technically it's a standalone. I've had already a couple of people come to me saying, we want more of these characters. We want more of the world. So I do have the sequel coming. It's not going to follow the same main characters, but it'll answer some questions that people might have had about the first book. It'll show you a little bit more of the world beyond the rift. So that should be exciting.
Yeah, I think that's great. And also, I agree. I think it's unique because, at least in my recommendations of fantasy based off of the series that I've read, is like, well, what do you have going on in your life right now? Like, how willing are you to commit to thousands of pages worth of reading? Because you're going to finish book 1 and you're going to have to start book 2. And then, but you're going to be exhausted because of all the world building and all the things, especially if you're new to fantasy. And so to know that you can just, this is a fun read that you can read and you'll have closure. And another thing that I noticed on some of your reviews on Goodreads, which I thought was like really high praise, is that this is good for people's like first introduction to fantasy, which I think is great for like it to be your first book. And you've already done such a good job of like putting what was in your imagination on the page so that other people could see it so vividly that they like understand it. I feel like even when I started ACOTAR for the first time, coming off of reading romance books, I was like, I'm not even, this is English. I know it's English, but it's just different. Like it's taking me a lot longer to read this book. And so I feel like for this to be your debut novel and being able to get praise like that, where someone's like, yeah, this would be a good book to give to someone who had never read fantasy before. Like that's very impressive. I think that's a very hard thing to do.
Thank you so much. No, actually, it's funny you would bring that up because one of the other inspirations that I had in writing it was my boyfriend. I wanted him to be able to enjoy my books. But he's one of those people that can't like imagine things in his head. So he's like, I need very explicit detail. Like, I need you to tell me what's where. I need you to tell me who looks like what. Like, I cannot make something up. So like, I need detail and I need it to be like believable enough. So that was kind of one of my inspirations, was that I wanted it to be very readable with like digestible world building, you know, a level where there's still things that you're familiar with, and then also these new fantastical things. So yeah, that I was really so happy to see that other people were connecting with that and also saying that made me feel so warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, that's great. And he's read the full book?
Not yet, actually. So I was waiting until the manuscript was complete. And then he was like, well, you're going to have an audiobook, right? Like, I want to listen to the audiobook. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's still being recorded now. So he actually has not read it yet. He knows a lot about it, obviously, because I keep talking about it. And because, you know, I bounced some ideas off of him, even though he's not really a reader and especially not a romance reader. But still, you know, useful to get another person's perspective. So yeah, I'll really be curious to hear what he thinks.
Yeah. So is working with a publisher helping you get the audiobook going? Do they have a reader that you use, or are you reading it?
They have a proper narrator and everything. It's really exciting. Yeah, that's one of the things that they're handling for me. So they work with, I don't know what you would call it, an audio recording audiobook company, whatever. And yeah, so they gave me a few options and they were like, listen to some of their stuff, see who you think is best. So I was able to pick the final narrator.
That's
and
awesome.
I was really glad because I have, again, like this vision in mind, right? And it was very important to me that the voice of Avery came across because she was so important to me and her character. So, you know, I didn't go with the person who had the most followers on Instagram. You know, I went with someone who I felt like they were a good narrator and that their voice really was a good fit for my main character and for my story. So I'm really excited for everyone to hear the final product. I haven't even heard it yet, so I'm very excited.
That's got to be a wild experience to hear somebody else reading your words out loud. That's got to be so surreal. That's like a whole other level of, like, you know, you see your reviews coming out and then you get to hold your ARC reviews at least, and then you get to see the physical book printed and you get to hold it, and then you see people posting pictures of other people holding your book, which is very cool. But then to hear like a professional like reading your book out loud, that's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. I still sometimes I'm like, I'm dreaming, right? Like this is not actually happening, but it is. It's real life.
Yeah, that is crazy. So you're working on the sequel right now?
I am, yeah. I'm about maybe a quarter or a third of the way in. Obviously, still very, very early draft. So I'm thinking it'll probably be done by like the end of the year because I'm not one of those writers that can churn out a book every month, unfortunately. I have a full-time job and everything. I know.
Boo.
But yeah. But hopefully by the end of the year I'll have a sequel, and then I'm already starting to think about potentially a third. So we shall see.
That's exciting. Do you have other like pipe dream fantasy worlds floating around in your imagination?
So many. Oh my God. Not all of them have like are fully fleshed out ideas that I could make into a full plot. But yeah, I have so many that like, oh, I had an idea for a character and then I wrote like the first 2 chapters or whatever, and then it's just sitting in my Google Drive folder, and maybe someday, maybe someday I'll go back to it, but I don't know. So we'll see. You know, we'll see too, like with the publisher that I'm working with. I'm not sure if they'd be interested in all of the ideas that I have, but you know, hopefully I can keep working with them into the future on a couple of other projects. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for chatting with me, being so open about your journey, about your writing, about your publishing, all of that good stuff. So for the listeners, be sure to follow. So they can follow you, author H. Levin, Levin on Instagram. And then does a publishing company are they doing like pre-release promotion right now?
Oh, I mean, I have like my ARC readers. That's pretty much it. Like I'm just doing promotions on like online and stuff. There's not really any concrete stuff. I do plan on putting together a few PR boxes and sending those out at some point, but those are still in the early stages. It's really, yeah, like we'll see when it comes out. And yeah.
All right. Well, for people listening, if you're interested in getting on that PR box list, you want to follow author H. Levin on Instagram. You can pre-order the Treasured One on Amazon. Am I missing anything? I'm only on Instagram. So are you on any other platforms anywhere else people should know about?
Not really. Instagram is the main one. I technically have a Twitter, but that one I really just post memes too. So yeah, it's really the Instagram is where I'm most active.
Well, then I should go over to the Twitter because your memes, I find them so enjoyable.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thanks again, Hannah. I'm so looking forward to July 9th when we get to read your book. And I think you've touched on so many things here that I'd like to unpack further in a longer podcast now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit. So I'd love to have you back at some point. We can unpack all the fun things about writing fantasy and publishing and all that good stuff. So until next time.
Until next time. Thank you so much for having me.
See ya.
Bye.